FestEVAL, which is going to be a week-long virtual series of events and sessions designed to be informal, light, fun, but hopefully also thought-provoking, to celebrate all things evaluation and to provide members with a chance to stay connected. I would very much like to acknowledge the many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander nations and lands from which we meet this week and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. Given we are joining FestEVAL from our bedrooms, lounge rooms, kitchens and backyards from around Australia, New Zealand and even internationally, I'm very conscious that we have feed on many First Nations across Australia and indeed overseas. If you would also like to personally acknowledge country, please feel free to use the chat function during today's session. Well, an online series of events is not the way we probably originally envisaged 2020 panning out. Hosting virtual events has proven to be a fantastic and effective way to stay connected and even draw new ties across the evaluation community. And it's enabled us to sidestep many of the physical barriers that we faced in the past in order to trying to bring people together. I probably would note that FestEVAL is not intended in any way to replace our Brisbane International Conference, which we normally would have held this time of year. That's been deferred until September 2021, and touch wood, and if safe to do so, we'll be able to get together face to face as the broader evaluation community and catch up with each other in person. But I'd like to thank all the AS members for supporting the Society throughout 2020. It's been a rather interesting year to say the least. There have been many learning and development events that have successfully shifted offline, and it's been heartening to see how many people have actually engaged with them and have found them of value. Following that theme, FestEVAL provides us, we hope, with a special opportunity to build on these and to reach out to members and non-members alike with an interest in evaluation. So I'd encourage you to participate in as many events as appeal to you, noting that everything this week is actually free. Many sessions are going to provide a great opportunity for engagement and networking, particularly each evening through the FestEVAL Club, which will be an informal place to discuss things that emerge in each day's sessions. The AS will also be holding its annual general meeting during FestEVAL, so that's going to happen on Wednesday, the 23rd of September 2020 between 4 to 5 p.m. And AS members are encouraged to attend and support the AS in progressing its annual business. Following the AGM, we're actually going to be relaunching the AS website, which has undergone a significant redevelopment. But now to today's session, which will present 4 provocations that will contextualise, challenge and celebrate the role of evaluation and evaluators. I'd like to now hand back over to Charlie. Charlie, would you be able to introduce our provocateurs to the audience?
Thanks very much, John. Hi, everyone, and big welcome to the evaluation community. We finally reached FestEVAL and it's an exciting week, so look forward to your participation and connecting throughout the week. Today we've got 4 fantastic speakers to talk about the place of evaluation in the world. And these 4 speakers will be forwarding some provocations for us to think about and hopefully discuss over the coming days. The first speaker is Simon Kuestenmacher, who's the director of the Demographics Group. The second speaker is Nicole Tujague, who is the co-founder and director of the Seedling Group. The third speaker will be Eleanor Williams, who is the director for the Centre of Evaluation and Research Evidence at the Department of Health and Human Services in Victoria. And the final speaker is well known to many, Michael Quinn-Patton, who does and we thank you for waking up tonight to support FestEVAL and the opening. And he's obviously a well-known author and independent evaluator. So without further ado, I'd like to hand to Simon for the first presentation.
Thank you, everyone, for coming in today and to be provoked a bit. Let me quickly introduce myself as a traditional optimist and a possibilist who usually tries to see the opportunities behind the data, all the good things that data can tell us about the future. But I want to do none of that today. Today, I want to show you the single biggest issue that I can see in Australia's near-term and long-term future. And in order to do so, I want to bring you back to my favorite day of the year, which actually only comes around every 5 years, and that is Census Night. If you remember Census Night, you were asked to write down in the little form or probably on your computer your profession, your job, and our friends at the ABS put your answer into one of 1,300 categories. That's the number of jobs that officially exist in Australia. And each of those jobs has a number attached to it, a number from 1 to 5. the skill level. That number indicates how much formal training you must have gone through before you're allowed to do the job. Skill level 1 jobs, highly skilled jobs. They need a university training. Doctors, engineers, midwives, essentially all of you guys fall into this category. Skill level 3 jobs are the traditional backbone of the Australian middle class. This is where all the manufacturing, all those trade jobs tend to sit in. Skill level 4 jobs are low skill job. You need some sort of formal qualification, but not too much. You need a driver's license to drive a truck, for example. Skill level 5 jobs are unskilled labor. You don't need a formal qualification. You learn on the job. Let's understand the distribution of those jobs as of the last census, 2016. And remember, if this was perfectly evenly distributed, we'd have 20% in each category. 28%, more than expected in the top half. That probably doesn't come as a big surprise, considering that we often talk about Australia becoming a knowledge economy. Sure, of course, we're a bit top heavy. We can understand this. Skill level 3 jobs, the backbone of the Australian middle class jobs, they make up 15%. Well, still a reasonably strong spine of the Australian middle class, if you will. And we're heavy towards the low skilled end of the job spectrum, the skill level 4 jobs. But how much really does the status quo tell us about developments? It doesn't. The trend is your friend. Let's look at just the net new jobs that we added to Australia between the last 2 censuses, between 2011 and 2016. And is it not true that half of the new jobs that we created in Australia are skill level 1 jobs, are highly skilled, highly paid skill level 1 jobs? There's no way you get one of those jobs without a university education. There's no way that we could have possibly filled all those jobs that the economy created with just the people living in Australia. We relied heavily on skilled migration to fill those jobs. There's no two ways about this. But my point, my scary number that I want to point out today is hiding here in plain sight. That is the 1% of the net new jobs that we created fall into skill level 3 jobs. We, in our head, we still think that the Australian workforce looks like a perfect bell curve. Sure, there are a couple of rich folks, a couple of poor folks, but essentially we all live middle class lives, have middle class incomes, have middle class dreams. What you are remembering here is a romanticized version of Australia in the 1970s. This is not the reality anymore. The Australian workforce looks much more like a U, where we have lots of poor folks, lots of rich folks, and essentially no one in the middle. And we're increasingly developing into this direction. My point here being, it is incredibly difficult to maintain social cohesion in a society that drifts further and further apart. You can see how easy it is to maintain social cohesion in such economies if you look over at the US, if you look at Brazil, if you look at South Africa. It is nightmarishly difficult to maintain social cohesion in this environment. What is happening to the Australian idea of, everybody gets a fair go? We're all kind of thinking as Australia as a very egalitarian society. Is this at risk? I would say it massively is at risk at the moment. But maybe, just maybe, the last 5 years were just an accident, a blip in the data that occurred. Well, so let's look at the job forecasts that are out there. Much of the same. This is the new reality. Everything that you do over the next couple of years will be occurring in this light of an economy, of a society drifting further apart into winners, into losers. In order to understand just how severe this is, it might help to actually look at incomes by highest level of education. What we're seeing here is the median income for a full-time employed worker in Australia that only has a year 9 education. With a year 9 education, those skill level 5 jobs, those low skill jobs are available to you. It's a hard life on those jobs. Whether you have 1 year of work experience or 50 years of work experience, you earn the same amount of money. And that is because you're being paid by the hour, by the kilometer, by the gig. That's very, very hard life. So please stay at school for another year. That'll give you another $5,000-10,000 per year. still not too comfortable to make a living in this environment. Better yet, you get one of those skill level 3 jobs that require a trade certificate. Problematic though, since we're not creating any more of these jobs. That's a problem. We see this bachelor education, university education, that really pays for a decent life. And if you have a partner, you have 1.5 or 2 incomes like this in a household, you can easily live a decent life in a capital city. It's very hard to live in a capital city on the lower incomes. And this is why people complain about housing affordability, is simply because there is not enough income coming in. But what about those bizarre post-grad ivory tower degrees that I'm sure plenty of you have? Do those actually pay off? Are they worth all the money? The answer is absolutely are they worth the money, but only once you hit your 30s. And that makes sense, because when you hire a graduate for your big organization, you don't care whether they have a bachelor's degree, a master's, or a PhD. They first need to learn how to book a meeting room, how to dial into Zoom. But then a couple of years later, down the track, then all of a sudden, education is key for promotions, and that then translates into income. And it's very comfortable to live a life in Australia on a high educated job. That's easy, but it's much harder. And it impacts every corner of your life if you don't fall into this big category. And in order to understand this, let's step into a supermarket. Let's step into the cereal aisle of your local supermarket. The benchmark Australian middle class breakfast is a bunch of Weet-Bix. They'll set you back 42 cents per 100 gram. That's the middle class breakfast. So how does the consumer market react if there are more and more customers who very, very carefully have to watch every single dollar that they are spending? Well, a whole new product category emerges. The home brand, the Aldi type of products, the wheat biscuits end of the market, 29 cents per 100 gram. So essentially 50% off. And the premise here is clear. We offer you the same utility, a wheaty breakfast, at a lower price. Same utility, lower price for the skill level 4, skill level 5 end of the market. How does the consumer market react to the skill level 1 jobs emerging at high numbers? Well, there's a whole new product category emerging there as well in your local cereal aisle, of course. Weet-Bix protein, that makes you stronger. Weet-Bix organic, that's great for the planet. Weet-Bix kids, I'm sure that's good for something too. But the premise here is clear as well. Sure, we're more expensive, 3 times the price. Sure, we're more expensive, but we offer you a marginally higher utility. More cost, more utility. That's the way that the consumer market operates. Don't, if you sell consumer products, don't mistake this for a wheat biscuit market. Understand that there are increasingly fewer wheat biscuit customers and more customers on either end of the market. That also means if you deliver services, public services to a large audience, we still pretend that we can easily sell this or provide the same level of service to every corner of the country, to every community, to every person. Is this realistic? If so, how can we adjust financing for this? This shape of this U-shape of the Australian workforce will touch every single element, every single project that you will be operating under in the next couple of years. And don't get this wrong. And this is my provocation. So please feel free to connect on social media if you want to be provoked a bit more. And you will now be provoked by Nicole Tujague. So please enjoy this next provocation.
Hi, Simon. That was riveting. Thank you very much for that. I had a few good laughs there as well. Welcome, everybody, and thanks for having me on the panel and in the room today. I would just like to share my screen and share some slides with you all. Hopefully that's looking okay. So I'm here today to say that I think we've got Indigenous evaluation all wrong. I'm a Gubbi Gubbi woman, Gubbi Gubbi and South Sea Island woman. So that little mark on the map is where my people are from. I'm a First Nations person of Australia. So in 2016, Sarah Hudson from the Centre for Independent Studies released a report saying that Australia was spending about $5.9 billion annually on Indigenous programs. And I guess I was a little bit shocked at that, because that's Indigenous specific programs. So not all the programs that affect Indigenous people that affect mainstream Australia as well. But then she reported that less than 10% of those programs are evaluated. And then I was a little bit more shocked. I think in actual fact, in the sample that she took, it was about 8%. And then those ones that were evaluated were mostly evaluated through a Western lens. So in my little consulting business over the last 6 years, we've been doing lots of Indigenous evaluation. So obviously in that 8%, but I can see lots of problems happening with Indigenous evaluations because we're evaluating the wrong things. And that's what I wanted to talk about today. So we're spending all of that money, and yet 1 in 3 Indigenous Australians live in poverty. And that's quite a staggering amount when you consider all of Simon's figures that he just talked about and how we're all earning these really great salaries in Australia. But obviously there's the other end of that U as well. So for my PhD, I decided to go into community and talk to Aboriginal people and ask them what they thought was important to measure when evaluating programs and projects that affect them. And so I went to the Kinchela Boys Aboriginal Corporation, and there I spoke to survivors of the Kinchela Boys home, I spoke to their descendants, and I spoke to the staff of the corporation that they've built. So for those of you who don't know or don't know a lot about the stolen generations, the Kinchela Boys home was a home that was set up to house Aboriginal boys from as young as 6 weeks old when they were kidnapped from their families. Now I use that word kidnap because the men specifically asked that we use that word. So now the men realize what incredible trauma they're carrying. Now that we know so much more about trauma and the effects of developmental trauma, they can really understand how that being kidnapped has affected them and how they've been passing down that intergenerational trauma to their families, to their children and to their grandchildren. So it was quite interesting when I started talking to them about what they wanted to measure. First of all, they said, if it's not healing, what's the point? And if it doesn't interrupt intergenerational trauma, then it's wasting money. Then we went on to talk about how we measure healing and how we measure the interruption of intergenerational trauma. And they had lots of really great ideas how to make those things measurable. So then I started thinking about all of the evaluations that I'd been commissioned to do and our company had been commissioned to do. And I started thinking about the fact that we started off as the token blackfella, and then we went into being co-designed with. But what's still happening is they're still riding shotgun. We're still not leading Indigenous evaluation. And that's really problematic because sometimes the evaluation reveals some really great stories, some really great solutions, some really great recommendations from community. And often we're told, okay, that's all really good, but that's not what we're measuring here. What we wanted to know is this. And did we set out and deliver what we said we were going to deliver? And if we didn't deliver it, then what went wrong? And so there are really incredible messages and stories coming out of community that aren't going into the reports and are being ignored yet again. So I'm saying to the commissioning bodies, to the governments, to people who are holding the purse strings, give up the power and let Indigenous people lead evaluation of projects and programs that affect them. We have so many great young people going into universities and getting their degrees and have all this incredible skill, and yet we're still not listening to what Aboriginal people value. So evaluation is about measuring the value, but we're still not looking at the value that Aboriginal people place on things. And that for us is a big problem. So I'd like just to remind those sitting there thinking, yeah, but we do great community engagement and we have our advisory committees and we do great co-design and all of that sort of stuff. It's not the same as something being led by Indigenous people. It's not the same as looking through an Indigenous lens and through an Indigenous perspective. So have some faith, because we've survived for over 50,000 years using a sophisticated evaluation system that is our intellectual property, and we can be trusted to evaluate programs and projects that affect our lives. So that's all I had to say today. Thanks everyone, and I'm now going to hand over to Eleanor Williams.
Thank you so much. That was an incredibly powerful presentation. And I'm also really pleased to be here and have the chance to put forward a controversial position. And obviously also I'm presenting from Aboriginal land of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. So I wanted to put it out there that in many circumstances, evaluations are too slow. So we take too long to deliver findings and we miss the window of opportunity to have influence in policy and program design. So if we back up a step, how did I get to this point? So I'm a big believer, as are many evaluators and certainly lots of people who'll be here today, that evaluations need to be fit for purpose. And we know there's no one size fits all approach. But what we often talk about is method and scale, but not speed. And I think speed is a relevant component of utilisation, whether your work is used and whether it's fit for purpose. So people commission an evaluation because they have questions they want answered. And the sooner they see you can provide insights, the more engaged they will be in the process. So we often ask, what decision does the evaluation need to feed into? What's the final product? But we're not asking, if I could get findings to you earlier, would you do more with them? Could it feed into continuous improvement, program redesign? Could the evaluators be more inside the tent for early discussions, feeding in what they're seeing? Look, I actually think COVID's really flushed this out. And as some people know, I'm actually in a COVID policy role at the moment, and it's really shone a light on this. So decisions need to be made really quickly, because time lost equals people infected and ultimately lives and livelihoods lost. So it's one of the prime examples of where earlier just-in-time decisions are critical. But also many of the interventions are expected to have a short-term impact. So when we're introducing these population level restrictions, people hope to see change within days and weeks and not months and years. And this is really tricky because in general, in the evaluation world, a 3 or a 6 month project is seen as really quick, and maybe like a 12 or an 18-month project is more standard. But as we've seen this year, a lot can change over those shorter timeframes. So for example, in Melbourne, and I'm sure there's some Victorians here today, you'll know that restrictions have been introduced and eased within a 6-week period. And this is not the only context though where evidence is needed quickly. And there's a lot being written about the fact that government decision making has been speeding up. So more decisions are being made by government in a shorter time frame. And that's not just in Victoria, that's in jurisdictions across the world. And this is being driven by things like shorter funding periods and a faster media cycle, which force governments to make calls early on whether a policy or a program is working or not. So I guess I just wanted to throw down the gauntlet and say, as evaluators, we should see how fast we can go. So I'm offering up 3 questions for evaluators to consider before we do things like speeding up. So 1, what's holding us back, or what will we lose? 2, where would faster evaluation work best? And 3, what would it take for us to deliver faster? So on the first one, what is holding us back, or what could we lose? I think there's legitimate concerns about the integrity of findings when we're working quickly. So as a profession, evaluation has actually argued for longer time frames to achieve more reliable findings and deeper insights. And that's because we know we need time to understand stakeholder needs and develop program logics. We know we need to hear multiple perspectives. It's not a good idea to listen to the loudest voices. We need to establish comparison groups. We need to understand how the people who have received an intervention are experiencing it as compared to people who do not experience it. And we know it takes time for patterns to emerge in data. And that's things like you don't reach saturation points for interviews and focus groups quickly. So I guess the question here is it worth looking for acceptable shortcuts and presenting early findings if it means they're used? Like, do you accept that some early evidence is better than no evidence. And I think lots of us will recognise that terrible feeling of delivering a report only to find out that the decision has already been made on the program that we've been evaluating. So doing evaluation quickly is hard, but it's better than the work not being used at all. And there's something big that we could lose though if we went too far towards rapid approaches. Not to argue against my provocative point, but we're also, as evaluators, often working towards longer term, more robust approaches where we want to assess the implementation of policy and programs before we go to impact, and where we allow programs to mature and embed before analysing. So I think we all know there's some programs where this maturity must happen. And I always use an example of my team at the Department of Health and Human Services has been evaluating a program called Better Futures, which is about kids who are going to leave out of home care and setting them up better to have a better experience. And it starts with 15 to 16-year-olds, but you want to see the outcomes when they're 18, 19, 20. So we're evaluating that one over a 5-year period. So there are just some situations where a rapid approach won't work. And this is a real risk when arguing for faster products. And I should be clear that I don't think rapid approaches should be used for all projects and in all circumstances. But where you can move faster, there is something big to be gained, and that's better stakeholder engagement. So sustained interest throughout the process of evaluation, and ultimately the chance for more relevance and influence in fast changing environments. So that leads to the question, where will rapid approaches work best? And from, I guess from my experience in the Centre for Evaluation and Research Evidence in the Department of Health and Human Services, in the context of a health crisis, it makes sense to quickly jump in and start gathering some quick evidence. So in consultation with program areas, we came up with a 4 to 6 week evaluation approach to help consider the merits of new approaches developed to meet the COVID environment. So we set some criteria, we created a method, we met an emerging need. And we've worked with program areas on topics from all over the place, from telehealth for pregnant women using perinatal care, to communication approaches with culturally and linguistically diverse communities, through to new models for our perpetrator supports in family violence. And lots of people ask us, will this become your standard offering? Is this what a standard evaluation is now? And as I sort of indicated, for a lot of our business as usual projects, this approach won't work. So sometimes rapid methods just won't meet project needs. But in terms of where it will work best, I guess working from the current set of observations, we've run about 8 of these rapid evaluations, and we're going to try and do 20 by the end of the year. There's a few elements or criteria that make a project suitable. So one is that the intervention is being implemented quickly for a short-term impact. 2, there's a single cohort receiving consistent intervention and ideally in a single location. 3, the change can be measured. Things like health, like the number of transmissions, patient satisfaction, speed of treatment are really well suited to this, but maybe not family functioning where you really can't tell over that sort of short period. And finally, where stakeholders are engaged and available. And without this, there's a risk that you'll spend the whole project time trying to work out what was the intended change and or how you would measure it. So broadly, if you think about the suite of programs and policies in any setting, rapid approaches will suit some, but not all. So if this model endures, it will need to sit alongside other methods. But what would it take to deliver evaluations faster? So overall to date, I've seen 2 main factors required, and that's the right resourcing and team and the right stakeholder environment. So there's a saying across lots of fields that projects can be good, fast and cheap, but you can only choose 2. And in this case, you want them to be good and fast, so you have to lose cheap. So rapid approaches, in my experience, can't be delivered by one person because of the need to do work in parallel, and they can't be done well by an inexperienced evaluator without introducing the risk of shallow, rushed findings. So experienced qualitative and quantitative analysts are worth their weight in gold, and we should not underestimate the value of experienced oversight when you're running fast. So you need a team who can sensitively gather data in respectful ways from busy people, and design those like clever short surveys and undertake brief but pithy interviews, then synthesize their findings quickly and write short and punchy reports. And this requires experience and a toolkit to quickly adapt your approach and to recognize what's needed and then work differently as required. But not only this, you need a team who are comfortable working at this pace, and you need to build in breaks. So not everyone wants to be smashing out reports within days, and even if they do, very few people can do it over and over without getting fatigued. And then on the other side of the fence, you need to have stakeholders who are engaged and really want the finding quickly. So you need a project sponsor and a contact point who feel the urgency, but also have the time to support the work. So faster approaches need feeding. They need someone who'll send you the data, review survey and interview questions, and point you in the right direction for follow-up issues. And this can be a problem for external evaluators who also need to get contracting arrangements in place. So if people commissioning evaluations also want faster findings, they'll need to show how they can overcome those sort of procurement delays. But just a final point, which is something that's letting us run fast at the moment. So during COVID, research evidence that can provide grounding for evaluation is being delivered closer to real time, with lots of material being released before peer review. And this has been a real game changer, particularly with Australia tracking behind other countries in terms of the pandemic's progress. So for example, findings on effective interventions in abattoirs in the United States or aged care in the UK have been able to feed into policy decisions and provide benchmarks for evaluations in Australia. So my call to action here is this: could you speed up at least some of your work? Are there some projects that could be condensed and distilled and compacted to provide decision makers with findings faster? So standard evaluation approaches are too slow. Are you willing to speed up? And I'm keen to hand over here to Michael Quinn-Patton, who's our keynote provocateur for today, and take us from the next steps.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to be with you and in this festival of evaluation. And one of the things that I want to share is at the Transformation Conference in 2018, I had the opportunity to learn about and work with Simon Kneebone. And since then, we've been collaborating on a number of cartoons that I'm going to share with you, several that will have their world premiere during this presentation. Simon has been helping me describe the different things that evaluators do, the different challenges that we face, the ways in which we work, and how we have to address the needs of the people that we work with to make a difference. So in the context of the coronavirus, the worldwide pandemic, the social justice uprising around the world. I'm coming to you from Minnesota and Minneapolis, where George Floyd was murdered. My office is just a few blocks from where the demonstrations broke out. That connected to the climate emergency, to the increasing severity of weather. We are the first generation to know that we are destroying the planet and the last generation that can do anything about it. The economic depression, recession, financial turbulence that accompanies these things, the forest fires in Australia, now in California, and on and on. Lenin said, there are decades where nothing happens and weeks where decades happen. And we are in one of those periods. People keep asking about returning to normal. I am convinced that there will be no return to normal, not for the world and not for evaluation. We are called on to adapt in an ongoing way. The doomsday clock has been moved forward to 110 seconds before midnight, not only because of climate change, but because of increased nuclear and political and violence encounters around the world. Meanwhile, evaluation, now some 50 years old, grew up into projects. And over the last 50 years, we have gotten very good at evaluating projects and programs, goal attainment, implementation evaluation, outcomes, logic models, generating findings, lessons, and recommendations. But now we're being called on to evaluate mission, strategy, advocacy, policy change, systems change, complex dynamic interventions, community impacts, regional initiatives, networks and collaborations, inclusiveness and diversity, leadership, innovation, collective impact, scaling, environmental ecosystem sustainability, global systems change, and as the conference 2 years ago featured, transformation. None of these things are projects, and yet evaluators keep sticking these things back into a project and program mentality. What we're being called on now is to evaluate systems change, to complex dynamic systems change. That means that we have to do what we do in some new ways, transforming evaluation to evaluate transformation. And yet our training continues to be traditional for the most part, teaching people to do things that we've always done and not making the pivot to doing things differently. We are in a time where the four horsemen of the apocalypse, pestilence, war, famine, and death, are a wide range in the world. Less paid attention to are the four horsemen of calumny, fear, ignorance, smear, and bigotry. We are in an infodemia as well as a pandemic, the spread of bad information, misleading information, distorted information, lies. And so we are in a struggle between facts, evidence, truth, data, reality, thinking, versus post-truth, fake news, alternative facts, make-believe, groupthink, distortions. Evaluation is part of this larger battle, and we need to acknowledge our role and our responsibilities in that. With the four judgments of evaluation: merit, worth, significance, and use. We're being asked to apply both youth tests and truth tests, as Carol Weiss called for us to do some 4 decades ago. We sit in a world where there are claims of pessimism and bad news and optimism and good news, trying to help people sort out the difference. Are things getting worse or things getting better? We have to be both looking backwards and futurist, looking forward. And so we're still distinguishing between the simple, the complicated, and indeed the complex. But the complex now means that we are juggling multiple kinds of requests in complex dynamic systems. And this requires us to do new things in different ways. Developmental evaluation, which emerged as a way to help support innovation, has actually become a way to help people pivot in times of crisis. As we are all now developmental evaluators in having to be adaptable to changing conditions brought on by these rapidly changing systems. And in that context, then, the traditional static logic models with formative and summative evaluation are now engaging with programs and people in a variety of pathways where each of these developmental moments are pivots, where people are adapting to change conditions, and accompanying them in that pivoting requires evaluators to be adaptable. In real time, as we just heard, being able to respond quickly. The blue marble perspective calls on us, as seen from outer space without boundaries and without borders, to be able to understand how what's going on globally affects what's happening locally, to take a full Earth perspective about what's happening, to be able to zoom out and see the big picture and zoom in and see the consequences locally, to be able to look long-term, medium-term, and short-term in our work, to be able to see how networks around the world are affecting what's going on globally and locally. We're being called on to extract lessons from coronavirus for the global climate emergency. And can we learn from that history? This is the 250th anniversary of the birth of George Hegel, who famously said, "We learn from history that we do not learn from history." Evaluators carry part of that responsibility to help extract lessons, to help people learn from history, to deal with the conflicts between the political and the scientific, which have been so front and center in parts of the response to the coronavirus and the pandemic. We are part of the larger scientific community. I've been working with people who are trying to elevate evaluation to helping people understand and think evaluatively about what's really going on in the world. And yet we battle a world where people want to hear what they want to hear and are eschewing the truth. I've been doing a lot of work with people in agroecology who describe that field as science, a movement, and a practice, all three elements. Epidemiology is similarly a science of possibilities, persuasions, not of certainties or hard proof. We epidemiologists must persuade people to upend their lives, to forgo travel and socializing, to submit themselves to blood draws and immunization shots, even when there's scant evidence that they're directly at risk. Epidemiologists also learn how to maintain their persuasiveness, even as their advice shifts. the recommendations that public health professionals make at the beginning of an emergency. No need to wear masks. Children can't become seriously ill. Often change as hypotheses are disproved and new experiments occur. And so they're the things we know and the things we don't know, and the learning inquiry that we're engaging in about how to adapt in new ways. Even as the statisticians are calling on us to move beyond a world of 0.05 and replace that statistically significant notion with being accepting uncertainty, being thoughtful, being open, being modest. The principles now being propagated by the statisticians in place of the rigidity of statistical significance. In all of this, we are faced with thinking that we bring to this work, helping people think about what's going on, the critical role of evaluative thinking carrying increasing importance as we move forward. And so choosing what makes sense, being practical, Rossi's good enough rule, recognizing that we have skin in the game. Nicholas Taleb, who wrote The Black Swan last year, came out with this notion of not trusting anybody who hasn't been clear about their skin in the game. Peter Drucker said the greatest danger in times of turbulence is not the turbulence, it is to act with yesterday's logic. And so in the face of the coronavirus and the expectation of following the science, it turns out that what the science needs is evaluative thinking, the capacity of people to weigh evidence, to make sense of ambiguity, to weigh the pluses and minuses in the face of changing evidence, changing learning. And I see a future where we are an evaluation science, we are an evaluation practice, and we are evaluative thinking as a movement. And we need to do all three of these things in combination if we're going to fulfill our role going forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Michael and Nicole and Eleanor and Simon. I think you've given us a lot to think about, as we can see from the questions coming in through the chat. While Charlie collates some of those to answer now, do any of you have any responses to the others' provocations, to the population trends Simon has identified, what they might mean for evaluators, to Nicole's encouragement that we think about how we support greater ownership of evaluation by Indigenous communities and recognition of Indigenous knowledge systems in evaluation, to the challenges and the opportunities for going faster, as Eleanor suggests, or to the way we need to transform evaluation and be honest and open about the skin that we have in the game, as Michael suggests. Nicole.
So as a data guy, I was blown away to learn from Nicole that 10% of Indigenous programs are evaluated. I'm always shocked to hear how little stuff is actually evaluated. You see this with public money, you see this with private money, and I can't possibly wrap my head around how this is possible. And it, of course, needs to be then evaluated by the right people. And that there are no fixed systems in place for us to do this is just mind-boggling. So thank you very much for sharing these facts and your solutions.
Thanks, Simon. And I had a question for you as well, actually, because the ABS stats were amazing. I want to know, what does that mean for us as evaluators going forwards? What can we do with that information?
Well, I think it's important to understand that you increasingly you evaluate it in the context of a society that splits apart. And if you want to create the best possible good that you can create, is your project impacting all peoples along the spectrum equally, or are there people that are being left out? And the idea, of course, then becomes an issue of, well, can we just focus one end of the market? And sometimes we would argue that this is possible, or at least in an evaluation process, just to say, this is how we expect that the project impacts the top end, the middle, and the lower end of the market in terms of income, in terms of just socioeconomic status. I think that'd be really lovely to have this literally just written down somewhere, and somebody voicing their honest opinion of how some project impacts different stratas of society.
Eleanor or Michael, do you have anything to add before we move on to questions with Charlie? All right, Charlie.
Yeah, maybe now is a good time to bring in the question around decision makers and what decision makers are looking for from evaluators. So probably gets back to Eleanor's point. If our work is utilization focused and trying to have an impact, and we're working fast to try to have that impact, what are we hearing from decision makers, either positive or negative, about the work that we're doing in that space?
That's a great question, Charlie. And I think it's actually really hard to find out what decision makers think of your work. But it's been funny in this environment where we were able to have that conversation to say, you seem to be doing this really fast. When are you making a decision? They're like, well, we're constantly making decisions to adjust and update and consider what we're taking forward and what we're getting rid of. So we'll need something, this can't be a traditional format. And we said, okay, well, how fast would it need to be? And they're saying, we're making decisions next week and the week after. So it's sort of a unique opportunity to almost reset and reconsider what we should be offering and what we could be offering, and think about then how it applies to our broader, how our previous work, could we build in more reporting cycles? I think one of the suggestions was, do we need to think about different products? And I think we definitely need to think about different products. A big long report doesn't cut it. Where sometimes at this stage, I've even said, can it be an email, just like key dot points, or a single slide that captures what we're seeing at the moment? And we've come up with some templates and formats for that as well. So they're just getting the, what's the absolute must know information about what you're seeing on the ground.
Absolutely. Michael, did you have any comments on the utilization focused evaluation idea, how we can make our work most impactful?
Well, part of what I was suggesting is that we're going to have to be able to make the pivot to helping decision makers and policymakers think beyond projects to actually looking at things like systemic racism, the structural nature of the income gap, and the education issues, that working to think about systems changes. They're locked in a project mentality. The funders are locked in a project mentality. Evaluators are locked in a project mentality. And yet the call of our times is to transform systems. So we have to help make that pivot as well in the face of changing things. And I think we still end up being stuck in advising them about how to improve projects rather than to be able to address the structural nature of the systems changes that are ahead of us with climate change, with the pandemic, with the economic and financial turbulence. And the advice to them about how to improve projects isn't going to take us very far long term. To where we've been, it's not where we need to go.
Okay. We had an interesting question in the chat that got a bit of feedback. So for Nicole, it's a question around how can we measure healing and interruption of intergenerational trauma? I mean, these are huge questions, but some of the how around your provocation is how do we get that Indigenous voice and leadership? And then how do we use that to measure things that are really from the participant's perspective?
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. And when I started doing my research, I had one of those frozen moments where I thought, oh my God, okay, if we've got to measure healing, how the hell do we do that? But the more I talked to Aboriginal participants, the more answers kept coming out. And I was quite surprised. Well, I shouldn't have been, but I was surprised that all the answers were there, as well as the values that people wanted to be measured. So things like the staff at KBHAC was saying that, and we were talking about how could we be quantitative about it. And they were saying, well, look, at the moment we receive X number of calls a week that are crisis moment calls. We feel that if we're talking about the evaluation of a specific project that the uncles have written themselves. And they were saying, we'll know if it's working if we get less crisis calls and we get more calls early on asking for help. So there were some really good quantitative things as well as qualitative. Just the descendants were saying, when families start coming together, when we can start having more of our families actually meet at the gatherings because they understand the story of the uncles and why they lived the lives that they lived. So it's the same as asking community about their values. They also have some really great ways of measuring as well. And this is not budgets, this is not timeframes, this is not all the things that we're normally asked to measure. This is like, did this mend families? Did this, we have a wound that won't go away, and we have an opportunity to be able to heal that wound, but all we keep doing is treating the symptoms.
Absolutely. Did you have any comments on the rapid evaluation approaches and whether they might be suitable to some of the settings that you work in? Did it feel like, no, hang on, we actually have to go slower rather than faster?
Thanks, Charlie. The one thing we know that when we work in community or with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, we really have to respect the timing of that community. And I based my research on complex adaptive systems and Indigenous standpoint theory. And really in Indigenous communities, like I believe in most communities, we have complex things interplaying at any given time. So I've been in communities doing evaluation where there's been sorry business, or where there's been a huge payout come into the community because of payments come in for something. And that completely changes everything. So as soon as you let go of the timing thing in Indigenous communities and you start respecting the timeline, which is never linear, that communities are on, that sort of dictates for us. And sometimes it happens really quickly, Eleanor, and it's like, well, why hang around and spend more time than we have to? But sometimes, most often, it doesn't. And that's about respecting another knowledge system as well.
Thanks, Nicole. While we have Michael, there's another question for Michael in the chat. What new competencies are evaluators going to need, Michael, and what does training for evaluators look like in the future to pick up on what we need to be like, as you pointed out?
Well, clearly, I think that being able to think in systems and deal with complexity, and especially being able to work across the boundaries that we now have with specializations of sectors and projects, to be able to connect the dots between things like the pandemic and climate change and what's going on with ecological systems and sustainability and equity, that the capacity to help people see things across those dynamics, to work in teams with networks in a rapidly changing world. We have been really largely held captive by a search for static generalizable models. And under complex dynamic kind of systems, the thinking you were just hearing, models actually don't work. They're not generalizable. The ongoing learning, the capacity to adapt and to pivot and see what new things are going on, that becomes a different way of thinking. And that's going to require quite a different degree of training for evaluators to do real-time complex interpretations that are different than drawing up static models.
Thanks so much, Michael, and thanks to all four of our speakers. That's probably just about all we have time for this afternoon. So we'd like to thank all of you. You've certainly given us a lot to think about. To everybody else, we hope you'll join us to continue the conversation in the FestEVAL Club at 6 p.m. this evening, and in follow-up sessions on Tuesday and Thursday. Simon will be back tomorrow and Eleanor on Thursday, and my colleague John Benrose is hosting a space to follow up on Nicole's provocation tomorrow and Thursday as well. And last but not least, we wouldn't be good evaluators if we didn't have a plan to evaluate FestEVAL. So thanks to UniMelb capstone student Tara Collins, who's taking on that evaluation, and watch this space for an opportunity to provide feedback. Thank you, everyone. We really hope you enjoy your FestEVAL week, and we'll pick up on the threads of this conversation throughout the week.